you need some kicker help this week. He has 5 kickers you should start heading into Week 15. The first guy's Tyler Bass of the Buffalo Bills. Bass, he's been solid this season, especially the last 6 or 7 weeks is Bass. And last week he had a little bit of a down game versus Pittsburgh because he hit and missed that extra point surprisingly. But this week he versus the Denver Broncos on a Saturday game, remember, at 4:30, and this game is in Denver where the altitude's high, but the weather might be bad as well. But Tyler Bass, I think he'll have a good game kicking out there, and the Denver Broncos give up the second most fantasy points to kickers. So Bass this week in my kicker rankings, I had him at 5, so check that out if you haven't, if you need more kicker information. But Tyler Bass, he's been a solid kicker, a kicker I trust, and even with the PAT missed last week, he still had 5 points. So if he hit it, he wouldn't got some negative points. So Tyler Bass, he's going to score anywhere from 7 to 11 fantasy points, in my opinion, and he's the first start. The second kicker, I would start this week's Matt Gay of the Los Angeles Rams. Gay, he's been on a good tear of late here kicking, and now he's got the great matchup versus the New York Jets that give up the most fantasy points to kickers. Gay, the last few weeks, 10 points, 8 points, 6 points. And this week versus the Jets, I think he could get 10 to 12 in this one. They're going to have their way with this Jet team is the Rams. And they're going to get a lot of field goal attempts and a lot of red zone opportunities, I believe, here. So I think it's going to be a good game for him. And he's a kicker available in 83% of fantasy leagues. So if he's out there and you need a kicker in a pinch, he's not a bad guy to add to your team. The third kicker I'm looking to start is Dustin Hopkins of the Washington football team. Hopkins, he's been one of the best kickers now over the last month here with double-digit fantasy points going all the way back to week 9 to 14. So he's been on a good roll. This week, he's got a tough matchup versus Seattle. They give up the 10th least amount of fantasy points to kickers. But Dustin Hopkins, you got to ride the hot hand. I ranked him 6th this week in my kickers. The only thing, if Dwayne Haskins is starting in this game, I don't think Washington's going to have a lot of opportunities to be even in the red zone in this one versus Seattle. So that might be a little bit of a problem for Washington as a whole and for fantasy football. But Hopkins, you still got to start him this week. He's got double digits the last 6-7 games, like I said, and you just got to play him and hope for the best here. And he's still available in a crazy amount of leagues at 97%. The fourth kicker I'm looking to start is Daniel Carlson. He plays tonight versus the Los Angeles Chargers. And Carlson, he's been good this season for fantasy football teams. He's up there in fantasy points for kickers in the top 10. And Carlson last week, 7 fantasy points. Tonight versus the Chargers. The Chargers give up the 8th most fantasy points to kickers. And going back to their week 9 matchup, Carlson had 7 fantasy points versus the Chargers. I think he could get 7 to 10 fantasy points this week, and he's a guy who's pretty accurate and pretty good at his job at kicking the ball through the uprights. I think he's a good start this week. In the 5th and final kicker I have as a start this week's Cairo Santos of the Chicago Bears. Santos, he's got a good matchup versus the Minnesota Vikings that give up the 6th most fantasy points to kickers. Santos, he's available in 99% of fantasy leagues. But he's a kicker. He could get double-digit fantasy points here and there. And this week with this matchup, I think he could reach that double-digit mark. In Week 10 versus this same Minnesota team, he had 7 fantasy points. So that's not a bad kicking day. So 7 to 10 points I could see for Santos. And that's 5 kickers I would start this week heading into Week 15.